I have started the stream. I'm pulling it up on my phone here so I can just check it out. We have 530 total views, not bad. Cool. We're live. It seems to be working.
Awesome.
We have 0 viewers, but that's totally great. We have 530 total.
We had 15 last time. Let's wait a minute or two before we.
Oh, we've got 8 viewers right now. Bam.
That's what we had last time.
Oh yeah, we do it for the people.
Yeah, can someone resend me the link actually to the Twitch so I can pull it up?
Oh, it's just twitch.com/ or twitch.tv/OK no one stream.
Okay, no one. Okay.
No one stream.
Okay, cool.
By the way, no name V2. I was surprised to find out that no name Twitter handle was not you. Come on. No name's big.
That's true.
This Legion.
No name.
That's because my Twitter handle is a different kind of no name.
Okay.
Well, we are cruising now with 13 viewers.
Yeah.
Yeah, welcome to the official OK No One stream. We are LA Cryptoparty talking here with Ken Montenegro. We're very excited to have you here. Thank you. Here, well, just some of Ken's credentials. I don't have them totally memorized, but Vice President of National Lawyers Guild, very significant. Co-founder of Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. And then Technology Director at
Center for Constitutional Rights.
Perfect.
Thank you, Ken, for being here.
Yeah, no, thanks for making the space. I'm just like super thankful to be working with y'all and really want to build on the legacy and the good work that you folks in like the hacker space, maker community, and kind of like semi-autonomous like tech folks have built so far, just having been like so connected to that space, those types of spaces through the many years that I have. And yeah, and just so kind of to recap on some of those things. Yeah, so I'm lucky enough to be the Vice President of the National Lawyers Guild, which is the first racially integrated bar association in the United States. It aims to be the legal arm of radical and progressive social movements. And so you'll probably recognize like the marquee green hats that our folks wear at protests. There's also like some badass litigation that happens there, awesome international committee. So, you know, in it to win it on that tip. And for folks in Los Angeles, and even folks who've been following the surveillance landscape across the country and even globally, just like the immense presence of the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, because from get-go, the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition took an abolitionist perspective to surveillance. So like, let's say the Lawyers Guild is also abolitionist, so we believe in the abolition of the prison industrial complex, from cops to the jail cells and everything in between. The Stop LAPD Spying Coalition just really clearly from jump understood that surveillance was a weapon, and so therefore the abolition of surveillance. And so I'm so proud to be affiliated with that. Hamid and the rest of the crew that's like behind that, like holding that space down and really not negotiating, because I think that's one of the other things that maybe as we chat later today, just understanding in these very difficult times, what does it mean to negotiate as people are pushing for like community control of police or the incarceration of police? Are some of these asks actually making the systems that hurt us stronger? So if like, and we can talk about that more in depth as we go further along. And at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where I'm the technology director, the CCR has anchored a lot of the Guantanamo Bay litigation. They've also were one of the parties in the stop and frisk lawsuit. So I was just super lucky to move here to New York. So I'm shouting out at y'all from Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, and Queens, New York. I was lucky enough to take that job and become a part of that rich, radical tradition of figuring out how do we use the legal system to find these openings for justice. That's actually like true justice. It's centered around the needs of people and not just so much on like, oh, yay, look, we won, and this is a victory that will also help white supremacists, like some other non-profit legal organizations, don't really care. They'll support fascists. Yeah.
Actually, can I just ask quickly, do you think in the last 2 weeks there's been like a schism between organizations that were fully abolitionist to begin with and those that were like didn't know where to land and now are going that way? I mean, I'm just thinking about other how to put it, electronic anti-surveillance organizations that were maybe not abolitionists.
Yeah, I think that this is just such a painful and beautiful moment in time, because at the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, one of the frames that we used to analyze things is that this is not a moment in time, this is a continuation of history. And if we center, like, most oppression on this continent has been anti-Indigenous and anti-Black in its origin. So that's its ontology, that's where it begins. So at this moment in time, there is this interesting schism, and for me, I'm trying to figure out for myself, how do we navigate this super nascent, this like newborn space in a way that's respectful of all the tools that people bring to this fight. What I mean by that is, like, I believe that the state is an instrument that's designed from its inception to cause harm. That being said, ironically, I made time after a series of meetings to like run out of my house in like the humidity out here and go cast my vote in the New York elections.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's figuring out, like, how do we navigate these things in a way that doesn't say, like, oh, just to like name names, oh, the ACLU is bad because they actually want community control of policing, which I'm opposed to, because it among other things, it normalizes surveillance. It says, oh, if the cops go through a process, no matter how rigorous it is, then by going through that process, surveillance is legit. And for me, and I dare say even for some of the comrades at the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, it's like from go, it's like, no, we cannot normalize or accept these tools being used, because that conversation also comes in terms of abolition. You see that present in, like, people want justice for the victims of police violence. Sometimes some people are saying that, oh, if we incarcerate the cops, that's how we would get justice. But for people like myself, there's this big question mark about, can we get justice from the same system that creates harm upon us?
Right.
So some people are like, oh wait, so if we ask for special prosecutors, we're actually feeding the beast that's eating our other limb. So for me, it's like, how do we engage? And it's a challenge for me, who, comes from the tradition of when I was younger, of like, how do we throw rocks? How do we send black pieces of facts to like someone we don't like, etc.? So how do we like really stir things up? And now thinking like, oh, how do we do that in a way that actually reflects like a more life-affirming politic? So and also within that, thinking about how, for myself, and it's not an original thought that I have, it's really based on like the hard work that predominantly like Black female folks have done, is like, how do we like engineer, how do we change our minds to start to think about what things are life-affirming? And I think, like, particularly since we're chatting with like folks who have like done a shitload of badass stuff with like on the technology tip, it's thinking about like, okay, so what is the human element? How do we center the human experience? And how do we make sure that the algorithm, the app, the tool, whatever it is we're building, the network we're engineering, is actually not built to exacerbate some of the systemic problems that we see, that we experience, that, perpetuate this harm. And that's, I mean, I'm excited about so much. Like, there's good organizing happening in the tech space. And the big questions are, I think, for the movement specifically, is where are our tech comrades in terms of why don't we have like a movement tool like Twitch or like Zoom, or like, well, we have Riot, which is pretty good. We use that at the CCR for the IT team to do like Slack-like stuff. But like, how do we propagate these tools in a way that doesn't make people, especially organizers on the ground, feel alienated? Like, right. Oh shit, I'm used to doing everything in Google Docs. Why are you trying to knock me out? I just want like a tool to track like names and numbers, and I want to call it a database, even though it's not really a database. so stuff like that. So.
We were discussing earlier, like over the years, you see different friends joining Signal, like after a certain event. You're like, oh, you got the message.
Right.
Oh, I see it finally got through to you.
Yeah.
I just want to hop in real quick and say that anyone on the stream, feel free to chime in with questions and we'll respond to them as maybe at the end, or we'll figure that out, but feel free to jump in with questions. But just also on that comment, yeah, I mean, I think that is a lot of what we deal with. Like, yeah, the balance, it seems like the surveillance community, or the crypto community can be very dismissive of organizing that doesn't take every precaution, and or that balance between like having safe practices and just accepting that not everyone is going to have full security, you know, and that's
How did you put it last time, Dave, of describing our group?
like just terrible cryptography amateur people who are very ill-equipped to use the technologies we talk about.
Yeah, by way of example, what that looks like, and kind of like my history in terms of digital insecurity work, was in 2000 helping some folks from School of the Americas Watch who were getting arrested at Columbus, Georgia. And back then it was like, oh, hey, here's how you wipe the SIM card on your feature phone.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, here's how you set up a PGP key so that we can do messaging. And of course, the irony is that after the event, a lot of people were like, oh, I'm not jumping through the flaming hoop of key-based cryptography anymore.
Right.
I'm just going to do like emails in the clear. And it's kind of, and the Signal piece is a really funny, good, and also like kind of sad example, because after the election of the current president, there was like this, like exactly like Tim said, like there was this like flood of like, oh my God, so-and-so's on Signal. And I was like, oh, cut it out. I don't care. The funny thing is now with this uprising, a lot of people who used to be on Signal are now back on Signal. So I think for me, it's also that challenge for, especially technology folks like to think, and I'm a systems person. We like to think about systems, and we like to think about redundancies and making sure that we're all on the same page, that we do things the same way, because it lends to efficiency. If we all comment the same way, then we know like, oh, I don't need to bother Jack about whatever this is. I'm just going to look inside of it, and oh, that's why he did it. All right, cool. Let me change that up. Mm-hmm. So in social movement, I think like there are a lot of things is that particularly and I think globally and historically, social movements don't have the reflective time that a lot of technologists have. So like I think that's one of the cool things, and also a curse for technology, where a lot of technologists can actually sit back and be like, yo, all right, I want to design this. Let me put up a couple of prototypes. Let me see what libraries I'm going to use to create X, Y, and Z. Let me put it in a project management framework. While a lot of social movement work is like, man, they're killing us and we got to do something about this. And so for me, that's been one of the challenges. And that's why I never say that I'm an organizer. I'm like a systems person. Whenever I can use like my legal knowledge, whatever that means, whenever I can use my legal knowledge to support the movement, that's awesome. If I can use my technology to support the movement, that's awesome as well. And at the same time, I think that it's also an opportunity to challenge folks who are doing organizing, where organizers are always like, oh, meet folks where they're at. But it's really interesting to see how organizers forget that and throw that out the window when they're dealing with tech folks. A lot of the work that organizers bring to tech folks, and I would love to see like that landscape shift at this moment of crisis, and potential like awesome fucking change, to see how do we engage as partners. Like, how do we like celebrate the humanity and the knowledge that each one of us brings, and be like, oh, and this is what we all fucking need to build. Dope, let's do it. And let's actually like create a process that makes it happen, rather than a lot of organizers have a transactional relationship with the techies, where it's like, hey, I need a database. Okay, what does that even mean? Who needs to access it? Who's going to manage it? Where is it going to sit? Like, how secure does it need to be? And then like, oh, you know what? Fuck it. I know you just spent 20 hours doing something, but we just did it in Google Sheets. And it's like, what? That hurts my feelings. So yeah, so I think there's a lot of that as well, where I think like technologists need to figure out how do, and I would say technologists, lawyers, scientists, both social and hard traditional sciences, anyone who's like a so-called professional is figuring out how do we interface in a way that's both respectful and useful with people on the movement tip, with like badass people in the community, and also just also throwing down the gauntlet of like, oh shit, you know, many of you like organizers want to abolish capitalism, but the way that you approach technologists is hella capitalist, because you're like, oh, I want a product that does that.
Right.
And then they get all Karen about it. They're like, can I speak to the manager? It's not done yet. And it's like, doesn't match up. Come on, let's reboot this shit.
One, and I think on the flip side, like part of where we started was feeling like at least in like the crypto world, like that was a very like libertarian adjacent, like their goals were not compatible necessarily with our values, especially yeah, a lot of in the ways they talk about like what privacy is for and just the yeah, the like sovereign citizen kind of like adjacent world. And it can be a really interesting coalition of people, but the need for that information to come from less like Bitcoiny places, I guess.
I love that. I think I'm going to use that now as like a shorthand. Bitcoin basis. Fuck that shit. No, you're so right, because I think that for me there's this even how so, and it's like occurs. So my background's in history and comparative literature. So and like being a lawyer, language is like super important, and it's important that we use these terms. And I think like how we surrender language is so fascinating to me. Where if we think about like the European tradition of like libertarian communalism, it means something so different. Like when we talk about libertarianism here, we think about it's people who are like, I got to the top of the ladder. My job as a libertarian is to kick that ladder down now, or pull it up and burn it, and break it up, or whatever. So I would be like super interested in thinking like how, particularly, and I think that's one of the risks with like really good comrades like EFF, is like how does that historical selfish capitalist libertarian strain as it appears in like US based like technology movements, which kind of set the tone for the how global technology is framed, how does that get disrupted? How do we make sure that like, and I think free and open source has done like a lot to kind of shift that understanding, but it's also done it in a niche because it requires so many skills, so much free time to actually like to and I don't want to say it, but I'm just going to say it. It requires so much free time and privilege, monetary, socioeconomic, and linguistic privilege, both like coding and also in terms of spoken and written, to like meaningfully contribute to an open source project. So figuring out like what are those barriers there. But I think going back to it, I think open source is one of those good examples of like, this is what democratic collaboration for the greater good or for greater problem solving at scale, let's call it that, for problem solving at scales look like. And I just want to lift up like the good folks at like Lumio, who have built like a badass like decision making support tool that on one of the groups I'm involved with, the Radical Connections Network, which is a network of movement technologists, where we use that for our deliberation and decision making. And it's awesome. It's created by like some New Zealand anarchist, hardcore techies that have like done a good thing because they believe that democracy is important and decision making matters in a way that's transparent, equitable, etc. So I think that there are openings for that.
Is this a good time to flag the news about the Open Technology Fund?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I have mixed feelings about it. So I think in the digital rights space in the US, I think it's important to protect the Open Technology Fund, so OTF for short, because OTF has funded the development of things like Signal and a lot of like super important projects. At the same time, I really want us to approach these things in with a fully clear mind about how some elements of like the the US funds a lot of digital initiatives because they provide benefit or advantage to the US imperial exercise, be it through the surveillance state or through just like straight up nation building exercise or nation destabilization exercises. So figuring out how we balance that as well is super important when we're talking about US run funded entities and their relationship to the tech sector.
Yeah, OTF is under Radio Free Asia, I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure, which is, a propaganda tool to spread the joy of the United States around Asia.
Yeah.
So OTF, you're saying that created Signal. So this is kind of like a similar like
OTF
DARPA.
was a fund under Radio Free Asia that provided funds for Signal, Tails, Tor, and a bunch of others through grants through kind of this other portion of the US government. And recently, the head of, I'm pretty sure I'm probably going to botch this, but the head of Open Technology Fund resigned after the congressperson managing it changed, I think, something like that from Trump.
Yeah. So you 80% right. That's, and that's, you got the important pieces right. So like some of the finer details are, so the head of OTF, and I think I would love to see more government officials do this. The head of OTF resigned because there was also a shift under the current administration to use more, or it appears that the current administration is pivoting OTF to use more closed source tools, while OTF has a tradition of funding open source projects. And even if they are open source, like circumvention and anti-surveillance projects, those are all projects that movements actually have been able to use. And I would lift up like the good work that the sex work community, like New York's lucky to have like hacking and hustling. So there's like been a lot of like really cool stuff in how these anti-surveillance and these circumvention tools have been used to protect people at targeted or marginalized communities. And at the same time, for me, it's important to like remember the origin story. And so at this current point in time, right, the head of OTF has resigned because there is this strategy pivot that appears to be taking OTF to more closed source projects, which kind of fits like with this administration, where this administration just being like the culmination or the apogee of the neoliberal exercise is pushing to like, how do we enrich businesses that are never going to give shit back to anyone while we're in charge. And it is unfortunate because I think that there's a complicated history to OTF, but I think there's a lot of bravery for a government official to resign. And I think that even with my anti-imperialist reservations about some of the OTF stuff, OTF has just been there and built the tools that a lot of us rely on. So I would hope that folks show up for OTF.
Which, yeah, I guess speaks to kind of a lot of crypto, like, yeah, no name you mentioned, just Tor, like, yeah, this comes from DARPA, and we're dependent on these entities, or we're using these things that emerge from these very kind of nefarious entities, I guess, or sometimes nefarious, not necessarily nefarious.
Yeah, and I really like how you categorized it as a tool. I think that's so smart because I think more often than not, I think sometimes technologists and this is like part of like the fucked up like Silicon Valley language, where it's like, oh, it's a solution. And it's like, no, it's an app. Like it's not a solution, it's a fucking app. Like let's get real about it. It's an app.
Right.
And it's like, oh, we're disrupting. It's like, no, you're not disrupting, you're just fucking shit up. So like being real about like the language that is used on these things. And while you were speaking, that's one of the things and thank you for saying that, because it made me think about how, like just going back to like the 70s, 80s, and even like time immemorial, when people seeking like their liberation have taken weapons from the people who oppress them, they're using those tools of oppression and switching them around. Whether that is like a long-term strategy, I don't know. But at the same time, anything that people are doing to try to get free or to try to like just survive and hopefully thrive, for me, I'm like, that's hella legit.
Right.
So also like figuring out like what is that nuance too.
Well, and ostensibly being open source helps with that process, and that allows you to vet what these things emerging from these Although, yeah, the question of like, is there a backdoor to Tor? And probably yes.
Well, at the very least, it like stops or minimizes, how much what the damage that privatization then does. Like I
Right.
think a lot of this comes back, returns us to the whole kind of like reform versus abolition. And if abolition is driving everything, including the technologies and the tools that are being used, then the chances of moving more kind of like holistically towards liberation are greater than not. Otherwise, I feel like the conversations go back to like, or maybe a parallel way of thinking about that in terms of tools is like exceptionalism versus liberation. So when it's not called an app, for instance, or it's not called what it is, then it's really just a trick to get something to work for one person or a small group of people who then knock down the ladder, because that's the name of the game.
Yeah, I love how you put that, because yeah, it makes me think about how like even how when we talk about words like community and how sometimes like we just like we don't even say digital community anymore. It's like, oh, my community. And it could be like an online community, and trying to figure out what does that mean? How does that rob us of the in-person experience? Which like as someone who moved to New York in January and has been like, oh my God, I left all my people and I'm like in an apartment by myself. What is like what do these things mean? What is the buffer, or the salve, if you will, the medicinal impact of online communities and using video platforms like we're doing today in the time of pandemic? And for me, it's been really fascinating, as someone who's super used to video calls, just thinking how my framing and understanding of it has shifted, because I would have never thought of like, oh, I'm doing a video call with my son before. I'd have been like, no, I'm getting in the car and go 10 minutes and I'll track that fool down. And now it's like, oh, this is so amazing. I can have like an intimate moment by the screen. And at the same time, I don't want to pretend that's like a revelation that like I came to on my own. I think that in particularly in like the tech space, just thinking about folks who've done disability justice, or the techies, we call it accessibility work. So just thinking like, oh shit, all the things that they've been telling us for like 20 years
Right.
are true, and they're fucking attainable with like a little bit of effort. Closed captioning is now like really popping.
Right.
Oh, people are doing ASL when they have like their Zoom calls, etc. And just thinking how like the disability justice community has been like, hey fuckers, like you need to include us. And it was like, oh, it's so expensive. That's so much effort. But now that everyone's remote, it's like, oh, suddenly like the fucking floodgates opened, homies.
Right.
So also realizing how, once again, in a historic continuum, do we place like this moment in time and recognize all the people who came before us and like laid the groundwork?
Totally, because it goes back to who's being centered. Like part of the resistance, at least kind of a lot of institutional resistance around making, for instance, spaces ADA compliant or things like that was always like, oh, well, really, who's going to be needing that? And the rhetoric was always, it's too small a group basically for it to be worth it financially. Whereas now everything's been switched, and it's still like, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true, and it's so important to like use the language that you used of like who's going to be centered, because that's like the reminder, like at this point in time, is who is being centered in how technology is working. Like let's say in like tech news, a lot of people have been celebrating like, oh, Zoom is going to like give people like, even if you're free, look, we won, like now Zoom is going to do end to end. But it's like, no. If you read the blog post from Zoom, which came out last Friday or something, some like folks aren't reading it, but I did because I'm a paying Zoom subscriber. But I was like, hey, I actually want to like see, what does this mean? What are the implications of it? That folks still have to go through like a verification process for them to actually be able to get end-to-end encryption. And what does that mean for like people in like a marginalized kind of like, peripheral community status, like let's say sex workers, day laborers, unhoused folks. For all those folks, what does it mean for them to actually have to go through like a fucking hoop of validation or verification for them to get end-to-end encryption, and how awful that is. And at the same time, how broadly within like digital freedom space, a lot of folks are like, yeah, we made Zoom do it. And I'm like, kind of, sort of, but not completely, not the way that I think some of us would like to see that happen.
I just like the implication that if you pay, you're allowed to do terrorist organizing, and they will report you if you're on the free service.
We're about halfway through. Should we pivot a little bit to some contact tracing? Ken, I would love to hear your story about your personal story, but just as a primer, I don't know if anybody read this article. There are a couple out there, but this was the key finding from this. Hold on, let me just tell you, right? It's from top10vpn.com.
Beautiful.
So you know it's legit. But contact tracing apps are being used in 28 countries, alternative digital tracking measures active in 35 countries, physical surveillance in 11, but I'm sure it's way more than that. COVID-related censorship imposed by 18 governments. Internet shutdowns continue in 3 countries despite the outbreak. It's from top 10 VPNs. I'll drop it in the channel.
Great.
There are some other great articles out there,
Always
but I like their wrap through it.
Hang on, I'll be
Yeah.
So shit is real.
Yeah,
Countries are using this.
This shit is real, and it really hits like a couple of things in terms of like historic work. So I'll go to the personal really quickly then. So I moved here in January. In March, I was laid up for 12 days with 102, 103-degree fever, and for 5 days of that time, my lungs were contracting. I tested positive for COVID, and it was horrible. It was terrifying. And concurrent to that, I was right as I was before I got sick, I was actually helping author with like some wonderful, beautiful comrades from Vision Change Win and the National Lawyers Guild, and one like amazing person from the ACLU. We were assembling a Know Your Rights kit for COVID that I'll make sure to put in the chat. And so what we did is we're like, oh, as we're seeing this development globally happen, what is it going to look like when it hits the US? Little did we know, all of us were in New York, that it was coming so hard and so heavy. And the neighborhood I live in was one of the epicenters in the US, where one of the physicians was like, oh yeah, more than 50% of this neighborhood is like hit by it. So it's a predominantly immigrant community, a very brown, very beautiful community. But yeah, it really took it on the chin, and I was one of the people who got sick. And so it was like this interesting exercise in just a variety of things, where someone who's like very, tries to be cognizant about what I'm agreeing to, everything moved to telemedicine really quickly. Conferring with one of my doctors, they were like, oh yeah, by the way, I was like, oh, thanks for your help today. By the way, how is this app vetted? And they're like, oh, by the way, HIPAA on a lot of these things has just been kind of like, whoo, hands off, do what you got to do. Like, you do you, just take care of your patients. And so for me, it also like is another reminder of when moments of crisis happen, all these legal frameworks that the state likes to remind us are immutable. They cannot be moved. They cannot be changed. It's like gloves off. It's just kind of thinking like all that money that was provided to like corporate bailout, how that didn't exist. Like we could never afford like universal health care, but suddenly we can afford to bail out like these robber barons again, like historically congruent with like US history. So that was like one of the like the early things in my experience with COVID was like, holy shit, like HIPAA is like Swiss cheese now due to the pandemic. Then when I got tested, one of the forms said like, oh, we will share your data with New York State Health Services. New York State Health Services, and there's legislation that's been submitted, but it's not going anywhere right now, to the best of my understanding, that's trying to create a firewall between the public health data and law enforcement. Like the state is all law enforcement, but between like public health data and regular state data, that type of firewall currently exists with things like census data. It doesn't apparently exist with a lot of health data. And of course that is going to vary by state, because each state can usually determine in their own jurisdiction, like whatever department collects that data can kind of set the rules for that data. So that's definitely one of the fights that it'd be interesting to see folks in the digital space and the privacy space be like, oh shit, this isn't a coding fight. This is also like potentially a legislative fight. Like, how do we get like people, like legislators, to like do something about that?
Could you mention, because I think a lot of people don't even understand what they are, what fusion centers are and how data changes hands between different agencies?
Yeah, so that was one of the fights that we had at LA at Stop Other Kitty Spying, where fusion centers are a waste of money. That's all they are. No. So fusion centers are, it's kind of like the honeycomb clubhouse for law enforcement, where all these like useless ass law enforcement tools come together. They'll watch TV to collect open source intelligence. They'll do like these like really wild data sharing exercises. So like if you got a parking ticket in the city of Long Beach, the fusion center in Norwalk will probably have access to that data, and like a sheriff could be like, hey, that's my neighbor from across the road. I don't like him because of bumper sticker. And potentially all that data could be misused. There's actually like a lot of arguments to say it's been misused, but the fusion centers are also veiled in secrecy. So fusion centers also manifest themselves as a joint regional information centers, et cetera. There's a report from the US Senate that's getting kind of old. It's at least 5 years old, if I recall correctly, that says that the fusion centers do nothing to advance national security or to protect people. But they are still in existence, and there's still these information clearinghouses. So that could play out with like both the health information that's collected when it's like, oh, I took this test to know whether or not I've been exposed to COVID. That could potentially go to a law enforcement database. There's a very big question for migrant communities to figure out whether or not that will be also factored in your ability to naturalize or to gain like any type of permanent status. Like the good folks of the Immigrant Defense Project in New York City, they're like really keeping an eye on that, as I'm sure other like immigrant rights folks are. But there are just so many questions that present themselves with this disease, with this pandemic. Yeah, and then we moved directly to like contact tracing. How for me there's this big tendency that it's good seeing some tech folks disrupt it. Many times we have a solution that can be solved by people power, and yet we want to build a fucking app for it. It's like, yes, if we only hired like 50 people in each town to do this, we'd solve it. It's like, no. Let's hire 10 cats to work for 6 months, and they'll build an API that connects to this one thing. So it's also figuring out like, okay, so as which is tied to like the larger issue, where for me as Vision Change Win, the National Lawyers Guild, and Gabriel from the ACLU, as we were working on this Know Your Rights kit, one of the big things that we wanted to do was how do we center this on both an abolitionist framework, like from jump. So this would have been in early March. That we want to center like, oh, how does community experience and non-reliance on the state look like, or at least a healthy skepticism of the state look like in terms of asserting our rights? How does this not become like a legal exercise of like, the Fourth Amendment says blah, 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 when it's like, yeah, you know what? Law enforcement doesn't give a fucking shit. Like, they'll let the court figure out, but they'll like lock you up overnight. So like, how do we make sure that we're also like hella legit and straight and like solid, like boom, here it is to people in a way that's accessible? And also, how do we make sure that we don't use the language of the oppressor? And what that looks like is a lot of the language about fighting the pandemic has turned into the language of national security, where instead of the pandemic being seen as a public health threat, it's rapidly become a national security threat and an economic threat. And so we're using the wrong tools, what I see as the wrong tools, to address what at its core is a public health challenge. Right. And so it'd be interesting to see like, how do we center public health and the people who know fucking public health, rather than like these venture capitalists who are like, oh, and I'm going to solve it for you by this contact tracing thing that'll do X, Y, and Z. Or by, oh, we need to exercise like heavy duty incarceration, which is what the folks in El Salvador did under the clown ass fascist Nayib Bukele, where it was like, oh, you came, we're going to actually put you in this like mandated quarantine zone, which fortunately has not happened at scale here. Like here, cruise ship, some folks were put in forced quarantine, but we haven't had mass quarantine yet. It'll be interesting to see how phase 2 or wave 2 looks like.
I was
Could you just speak briefly about the language you used in that document around quarantining versus telecommuting versus self-imposed at home? I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, so one of the things that we wanted to do was make sure, once again, language is super important. So in the document, or at least in early versions of the document, we strayed away from like language like martial law, because martial law is like a legally operative state of being, where even if it feels like martial law, it's not martial law. So like, let's stay away from that language. We also felt it was super important to differentiate between like self-isolation, someone who's like a work from home person, like telecommuting person, and someone who's like straight up in quarantine. So quarantine, we decided like, oh, in the document, we kind of want to remind folks like, hey, respectfully, that's when your ass is sick, and either you're quarantining yourself or the state is quarantining yourself. Just because you're locked up at home like Ken and all lonely, that doesn't mean you're like quarantined. That just means you're fucking isolated. So yeah, so for us it was important to like disambiguate these words, because if we want to make sure that we as like broader communities have the right tools to describe what's happening to us. Where if it's like, oh, I tested positive, or I had my fever read at an airport and somebody told me to go in this other place, it's like, oh, I'm not being isolated, I'm being fucking quarantined. No matter what they tell me, because I think like if we look at the prison system, which is like this breeding ground of like misery, even pre-pandemic, but now it's even worse with the pandemic, of like, oh, we're isolating folks. It's like, no, motherfuckers, you're putting them in solitary confinement, and solitary is torture. So also like, how do we continuously challenge and disambiguate the language that's being used to control folks?
So one of the questions in the chat is, kind of rumors that contact tracing is being used against demonstrators, and maybe at the end here, there's kind of, I guess, like one question I have is like this idea of like, what does public health, especially COVID, are there models that aren't oppressive? Like, what is a positive response to this look like? Because I think, yeah, maybe a lot of people can't imagine what addressing COVID without contact tracing looks like. And then, yeah, maybe we can kind of go into this question of the contact tracing protest overlap, and maybe we can talk about Tulsa a little bit at the end.
Yeah, that's a good question. So and for me, I'm just a big fan of like, I don't know a lot. I'm lucky to know a lot of people who know a lot. So like, let's say for contact tracing, I would have to like give hella credit to Bina from Stop LAPD Spying, who's an epidemiologist, and Bina like really cites and lifts up the response that Cuba has had, which is a heavy people-driven response of like, oh, you're going to get a home visit, etc. I would add to that the response of South Korea as a potential model, where it's like, oh, and by the way, here's a box of fucking food. Like, we're going to make sure that you're isolated. We're going to make sure that these masking laws are respected, which is like another like tangent where within like the Know Your Rights kit, I did the section on masking, and there are conflicts in law, especially like post-Occupy. A lot of jurisdictions said like, oh, it's against the law to wear a mask. But now in the time of like where masking is shown to have a public health benefit, those laws still remain on the books. So it's going to be interesting to see like how that conflict in law plays out, where someone's like, oh, I'm actually like obeying the law by not being masked. But now they're like these executive orders that are like, nah, if you're going to go out, get a mask on your face. So that as well. So I would say like the Cuba model, the South Korea model are potential promise. I think like with South Korea, there are some questions though, since those were rapidly developed models that leverage technology. And I don't think that there's been like a really good autopsy is the wrong term, a postmortem, which is even worse, right? That's depressive. An evaluation. There hasn't been
slicing the corpse open.
After action report.
Thank you. A thoughtful evaluation of what the privacy implications are with the measures they took, especially since South Korea was like all hands on deck we need to like bring in the private sector because we're not going to spin something up as a government. So it would be, for me, it would be super interesting to like find out like how do they balance those equities to identify like at what point are we sacrificing privacy, and do we also have this like, hey, if you try to monetize this data, fools, you're going to get sued, you might lose your corporate charter. I mean, I don't know, but like just options that come off the top of my head that should happen to every corporation that does whack ass shit. So anyhow, yeah. So I would say Cuba and South Korea are good examples of how the disease has been managed. Yeah.
Someone's asking, South Korea had legislation in place to allow government access to health records. Has there been any legislation like that proposed in the U.S.? That sounds kind of like what you were talking about earlier. About
Yeah, and I think that would be one of the wonderful, just one of the reasons why we're trying to get an intern, is we would actually love someone to like do a side-by-side comparison of like, assuming we're using the same legal frameworks, of what does that look like in a place like South Korea, what does that look like in Germany, and what does that look like in the US, so that there could be like a tabular representation of like, oh, this legislative model, or this in the EU would be a directive, whatever it is, this vehicle protects rights better than others. And at the same time, that's not my jam. I'm not a very big fan of like model legislation, et cetera, because it like, for me, it surrenders power to the state, but it might be useful for us to all build like a greater collective understanding.
Well, maybe with the last 15 minutes, could we talk a bit about Tulsa? And because I mean, we're kind of combining all these things. Oklahoma has like had very little restrictions throughout the whole thing. We hadn't had any, they tried to make people wear masks, and there was like 3 shootings across the state that day or something. And but now we are experiencing a spike after already head of the rally, and now Trump came to town anticipating a further spike. And then, yeah, it just is this incident a COVID transpose? I mean, I guess over like every city, COVID transpose on top of like, yeah, this nationwide movement. And could you talk about what National Lawyers Guild had a huge presence in Tulsa over the weekend, and just like that role of observers and watching what was happening, and
Yeah, so yeah, I'm just really proud and lucky to be vice president of the guild, because I like to think that our membership is just so badass about showing up as volunteers to make sure that the cops know that someone is watching them to protect the protesters, because many of us in the guild desire and believe that the protesters will be triumphant. So there's this false notion of like objectivity that I would really like to dismantle or challenge, because if we are to be the radical legal arm of social movements, it's like, for me, it's always fucking clear why I'm not on the streets. Like, right. I'm not objective. I'm just like, no, cops stay the fuck away, or like don't fuck with people. And I know that's my jam. There's no like permutation of like, let's talk to them and be their friends, etc. But I think at this point in time, there are just a number of challenges where I think just we were building up the conversation talking about the pandemic as a context, and then we get to this point in the pandemic where some people who really want to create public harm by not wearing masks and seeing like not being unmasked as like this how I exercise my freedom. We're at that point in time, and then another murder of let's just call it like 3 Black people, really, because it's not just George Floyd. There's Breonna, there's Audrey, there's like Ahmaud Arbery. There's like a confluence of like, a spark to rekindle something that's never died in this country, which is like the Black desire to be free from white violence. So it's a spark that ignites like Black folks and folks in support of Black folks to be like, oh shit, this is like fuck it, like shit's already bad and you're going to put this on top of us, hell to the no. And so I'm super proud of how the Guild has shown up, and just because the Guild shows up in support of social movements, we're not the social movement.
Right.
So how we've shown up in like this point of like renewed interest in like Black liberation, for me has just been so instructive. I would also like to like highlight how the folks at these protests, having been on the streets here in New York, are just so considerate. Like some things that have like fascinated me is, so when I was sick in my neighborhood, there was no Tylenol and there were no thermometers. Like when I tried to do like mail order, I even did I tried to do Amazon. It was like, oh, we can get you Tylenol in 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. And it was like, I'm willing to pay $60 for a thermometer. And it was like, oh, that'll be 2 weeks out. And so at the end, a friend from a couple of neighborhoods over actually biked over a thermometer that they had brought from Europe. So I had to like take my temperature, convert it to Celsius, from Celsius to Fahrenheit to know how much my fever was. But just thinking about like supply chains. So within like the protests that are happening right now, there's just so much like amazing consideration by folks being masked. The availability of masks, if you show up without a mask, there will be like 10 cats or kittens who like show up and are like, here's a mask, put on a mask. Do you need water? Do you need snacks? And just for me, that's a reminder of, oh, the state isn't going to save us and the state isn't going to keep us safe. We could probably do a better job if we had more resources amongst ourselves to keep ourselves safe, which is so contra to the freedom is equal to not wearing a mask, which means freedom is equal to keeping people at risk. And especially since most of those folks know or should know that the morbidity rates are so substantially higher on people of color, specifically Black folks. So for me, it's like, that is like blatant white supremacy, because they know that they'll probably be okay. And they're like, I don't give a shit about anybody else except myself. So that's how like that shows up. And I always want to like connect this back to like what was our core conversation, where our core conversation is about like, what is like the role of the technology sector, especially since the technology sector is predominantly white, predominantly male, predominantly like libertarian leaning, et cetera. It's like, where do these conversations and interrogations happen in the tech sector to be like, oh shit, you know what? We actually have a role to play, and once again, figuring out what that role is concretely.
Ken, could I take you back to the NLG as observers or independent observers, but you being out in the face, protecting people? How does that work with documentation and video and photos? What's the NLG's stance on that, and how that documentation gets used or gets back to the victim's hands?
Yeah, so I'm at this point in my life and career. Actually, before I left Los Angeles, I was lucky enough to train some folks doing cop watch. And so I can't say like legal observing without saying cop watch, because here in New York, I've been rolling with like the baddies from the Justice Committee to support their cop watching initiatives. So for the short version of the difference is, cop watching is gathering footage of filming the cops, really filming the cops, sometimes taking paper notes, hopefully a lot of paper notes, but documenting police abuse and violence and using that as a tool to immediately expose and demystify the role of policing. So it's an organizing tool, it's cop watching. The National Lawyers Guild, our marquee program, the Legal Observer program, that's a little bit different. So it depends by chapter. So some chapters of the Guild prefer people to not use video, and that's just discretion of the chapters, sometimes at the discretion of the legal observer. I know for myself, I'm a bigger fan of notes, but some people will record that footage, and that footage is intended to be used for litigation of like, oh, here we saw the cops doing X, Y, and Z, and we recorded it. Don't even pretend you didn't do that, pig. Like, you actually hit someone in the face with X, Y, and Z. So that's one of the big differences, is that the footage that is collected by the Guild is not intended to be like, I legal observed today and look at like all the 20 pictures I have of the cops being cops. It's actually meant, it's work product. So it's actually protected by ethical rules, like ethical rules within the legal sector. Ironically, yes, the legal sector has ethical rules, but so it's protected. It's considered work product. So it's our goal or desire and the fight to always protect footage or any documentation gathered during legal observing. Cop watching, on the other hand, and I have to like highlight the role that like witness.org and like other cop watch organizations or groups across the country have in building that collective knowledge, is that is usually put up immediately. And then I'd also want to highlight like that gray space between. There's like cop watchers who generally know what they're doing, legal observers who generally know what they're doing, and then the average person who has like their mobile phone and is hoovering up all this footage and sharing it on the socials, sometimes irresponsibly. So I think that's like if we kind of briefly talk about like the implications of surveillance in like protests, I think it's really instructive to see how, with going back to fusion centers, how fusion centers are the clearinghouse where all this internet footage is more likely than not being analyzed by multiple law enforcement organizations. Those law enforcement organizations, and in a really chilling, scary way that echoes back to like the Green Scare, or even to like what the FBI did with like folks who were labeled Black identity extremists. There's like this, oh, and now we're going to go visit you at home. And we're going to be like, oh, hey, are you the chairman of the board of Antifa? Because that's what we heard. No. But effectively, it is that type of exercise of like, oh, it's a crime to be associated. So we're expecting to see a lot more of that. And so I would encourage folks, if you hear that happening, to reach out to the National Lawyers Guild, because I'm glad that like we're talking to a lot of techie folks, because techie folks understand the value of patterns and pattern analysis. And for us, it would be interesting to see like, are there patterns? Are they predominantly going after Black folks, or are they actually going after like, oh, these are all high visibility organizers, et cetera? And within that, I would just want to reassure folks who are listening that there are really good tools. Like there's a site called grandjuryresistance.org, which has a lot of really good resources. The Center for Constitutional Rights has a document that's called If an Agent Knocks, which is made specifically to deal with like FBI visits. And the Lawyers Guild has its own like Know Your Rights like little pamphlet that's available in like six or seven languages at this point in time. So there are resources. I would encourage folks to be worried, but to not be afraid. I think like when the state at this current point in time, I think it's super important for especially for us, since we're seemingly non-Black folks on this call, for like how do like non-Black folks like step up at this moment in time and deal with it in a way that like builds like collective strength as opposed to fear. Because I think that's the goal of these visits, is to try to create a chilling effect. The other thing that I want to also connect to contact tracing is how in Minnesota, when folks were arrested, oh my God, I'm blanking if it was the mayor or the police chief. Someone was like, oh, and we're actually going to do contact tracing, et cetera. And what they were really saying is they were going to do effectively social network analysis. So like they were going to do network analysis on the people arrested. They weren't actually going to do contact tracing within like the public health definition of contact tracing.
Right.
So I think like, once again, when we're hearing these words being used, maybe we like also need to interrogate, like, does the person speaking these words actually know what the fuck they're talking about? And am I hearing this right? Like, what's really happening at this moment? Because it's just so easy to be afraid. And like we say at Stop LAPD Spying, like one of the other like big things is like, as we do this work, how do we do it in a way that builds power and not paranoia? We want people to like show up and organize and like fuck shit up and do like badass shit and affirm life. And to do that, you have to like wrestle with, reconcile, or identify and resolve the elements of fear that the state wants to get in your way to make sure you don't do it.
We've always said during trainings that you can't choose a level of privacy until you understand the levels of privacy. Someone asked in the channel, is NLG seen, or how often does video footage help defending protesters? I was just going to do it. Go ahead.
Well, the question is, I think you answered this, but does NLG footage get used by law enforcement or prosecutors? Or is it protected? Does that work product designation prevent it from being used by prosecutors, or?
Yeah, that's a tricky one because evidence is shared. So generally speaking, like this, once again, lawyers never committing to anything. So generally speaking, evidence is shared. So potentially any of the footage that is collected could be used if the footage that is supposed to get Comrade A off from charges,
Right,
contains like Comrade B, like doing something that's arguably illegal, that could be used to build a case against Comrade B, even if it gets Comrade A off. So it's there's no bright line, there's no like clarity on that. I think that's why it's important for all folks to be very cautious and very cognizant of what they're capturing on film.
Well, I guess
Film.
that question of, yeah, not really being a neutral observer, but being a neutral observer, is that part of how the NLG functions? That like, ostensibly you're there to support the protesters in their
this,
movement.
Like, I'm filming. Oh, now I'm filming over here for a while. Okay, now I'm back to filming over here.
Like, is that an intended purpose? That like okay, it's one thing to be like, well, this footage was supposed to get this protester off, but it's also implicating someone, versus like, well, the NLG just observed, for example, people like stealing from a Target. Would that is that part of the scope of?
Yeah, I know when I train legal observers, I would tell them like, if people are expropriating or liberating goods from a Target, that has nothing to do with your role as a legal observer. Turn that damn camera off. So that would be my instruction. Different chapters will have different trainers will have different frameworks, but I know for myself, I'm like, okay, if you're going to be filming, and my preference is like written notes, but if you're going to be filming, you're going to be filming the cops, and that's it. Yeah.
I think that this helps.
Could you say a bit more about why your preference is written notes? I think I have an idea, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, with written notes, it's a lot. I know what I'm capturing when I'm writing things down, as opposed to if I'm filming, I may inadvertently get something that I don't want to capture, that may not be immediately relevant to what I'm watching, and then I just don't want to create more risk when I'm out there. Like, I think I really don't want to do harm to the movements that I'm allegedly showing up for and supporting. So for me, I find it easier for me to just do that. The other thing is, and I know cop watchers and other folks have the same challenges. Managing video is so hard. Is like, where do I store it? What's a secure place to store it? How do I make sure, like, am I going to go home and review all the footage that I captured and flag that, oh, in the 2 hours of footage that I have, there's maybe 45 seconds that might be relevant.
And how could somebody else interpret it also? Imagine.
Yeah.
I just dropped a link to a Wall Street Journal article, which I think if you turn off JavaScript, you can look at it because they use like a paywall. But this reporter went through and contacted a number of people that recorded police brutality, like kind of epic cases over the years, and talked to them about the process they went through. But one story stands out, which is Faden Santana recording Walter Scott's death. And he worked with his lawyer to get the video to the victim's family. And the cops released their story. And then a week later, the family released this video that just totally undercut the narrative from the police. And so I think there's a timing that's really interesting, and not just putting things on social media, and using evidence smartly is really important.
And I just want to
thanks for highlighting that, because yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that folks should be filming the cops. I just know that for myself, within like my role when I do legal observing, that I'm a bigger fan of. I want to write things down and minimize the amount of digital footprint that I'm creating, because I really don't have a good management strategy for it.
And I just wanted to quickly shout out, Stop LAPD Spying is doing a stream starting right now with our friends, Color Coded Collective and Free Rats, which are, I think, two orgs that started with maybe somewhat similar frustrations and stuff. And yeah, they're awesome.
Are they on Twitch? We could do like that raid party where we all go on Twitch.
I don't know how to do that, but that would be cool.
I don't know either.
Does anyone have any last questions in the chat, or some last final thoughts as we close out the hour?
Ken, this is
Yeah, thank
so
you
great,
so much.
great to see you again and joining us. I read on your public Twitter feed that you're considering coming back to Los Angeles for a visit. So maybe I can wave at you across the street at some point.
Yeah, I'm gonna be home for my birthday. So yeah, I'm excited to be sweating in LA and not in New York. So yeah, super jazzed to be home. Really miss it, but also, yeah, it's really nice being here. There's just one. I think we're very lucky right now in terms of the U.S. Is just there are just so many opportunities to plug into good movement work that's happening, regardless of like what one's background is. So the fight is global. The fight is national, and yeah, I'm very lucky to engage in it with like folks like y'all.
Are there some technologies or groups you could highlight that people might not have heard of that they could look up to just like know who's out there and what things are happening?
Yeah, I mean, I would really highlight the work of the Radical Connections Network, which is a group of movement technologists where we ourselves have to do a better job of communicating our work out a lot more. Um, yeah, in terms of the straight up technology tip, I think that there are a number of radical technologists that are out there. And I think it's also just super challenging to enumerate folks without making sure that I'm not leaving folks out. But I know for myself, my community of practice, it just means the world to me, both like in terms of my technology work, my activist work, and my legal work, which are these really interesting buckets. But each one I try to respect. Like we're all bringing different skills to the fight. So yeah, so I don't think I would preference one over the other. I would just encourage folks to both in terms of technology and political and all these other decisions is that how do we show up as our better selves with an open mind and open heart, and also with like an open mind doesn't mean not asking fucking critical questions. I think this is a time to ask those critical questions when we're seeing like words like abolition getting used in a way that it rapidly will mean nothing. So also when we're seeing like collaboration being used, I would like encourage all of us in the technology world to like, what does that fucking mean? And does it mean like just being able to collaborate with people in English? Does this collaborative tool not have like a screen reader for people who don't have eyesight? So like also like how do we also like make sure that these things still mean something because they're super important concepts, ideas, values. Yeah.
Radical.
So awesome spending time with you all. Thank you for making this space, the invite. It's good seeing you again, and it's good meeting the other two of y'all folks. And yeah, and when the pandemic is over, I hope we can break bread, raise glasses, and all like that other fun shit that we used to do before the pandemic hit us.
Sounds great. Yeah, thank you so much, Ken. That was
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah,
wonderful.
thank you. This is really great. And thank
Awesome.
you for the
Thank
work
you all.
that you do.
Thanks
Awesome.
everybody out there in Twitch land.
Let's get those hearts going in the chat. Peace.
Take care, y'all. Bye-bye.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye.
All right, I'm stopping the stream. Goodbye,
Yeah, stop
everyone.
the stream.